58. The Carthaginian soldiers were now given a respite of no great duration, while the weather remained unbearably cold. Then, at the first faint glimmerings of spring, Hannibal left his winter quarters and struck out into Etruria. His aim was to enlist the support of its people too, either by coercion or by their compliance, as he had done with the Gauls and Ligurians. As he crossed the Apennines, he was overtaken by a storm so severe that it was almost worse than the foul weather of the Alps. Wind and rain together blew straight into the men's faces. At first they simply halted because either they would have to drop their weapons or, if they struggled on against the blast, they were spun round and bowled over by it. Then, when it began to block their breathing and prevented them from getting their breath, they turned their backs to the wind and sat for a while at that point. There came a huge crash from the heavens, and there were flashes of lightning, amidst frightening peals of thunder. Blinded and deafened, they all rose with fear. Finally, there was a torrential downpour, and the force of the wind rose all the more, so that pitching camp in the very spot where they had been caught seemed unavoidable. That, however, proved to be the start of a fresh set of problems. The men could not unfold or set up their tents, and what was set up could not stay up, for the wind tore everything apart and swept it away. Soon the water, whipped up by the wind, froze above the frigid mountain tops, and this brought down so much snow and hail that they dropped everything and fell to the ground, buried under their shelters rather than protected by them. This was followed by temperatures so low and that everyone, trying to get up or extricate himself from that sad mess of men and pack animals, could not do so for a long time. Their bodies numb with cold, they found they could barely bend their joints. Finally, shaking themselves, they began to move about and pull themselves together, and fires started to appear here and there, but still helpless, they all looked for help from each other. For 2 days they remained in that spot, virtually in a state of siege. Many men and beasts of burden were lost, together with 7 of the elephants that had survived the battle at the Trebia. 59. After the descent from the Apennines, Hannibal moved his camp back towards Placentia, halting after he had advanced about 10 miles. The next day he marched on the enemy with 12,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, and the consul Sempronius, who had by now returned from Rome, did not refuse battle. That day the two camps remained 3 miles distant from each other, but on the next the sides engaged with great fervor and with fluctuating results. At the first clash the Romans were clearly superior, so much so that they not only triumphed in the field, but after driving back the enemy, chased him to his camp, which they soon had under attack. Hannibal stationed a few men to secure the rampart and gateways. The rest he withdrew en masse into the center of the camp, telling them to be on the alert for the signal for a counterattack. It was already about the 9th hour of the day, and the Roman commander, his men exhausted to no purpose, saw no prospect of taking the camp. He therefore signaled the recall. Hannibal heard this. He also saw that the fighting had slackened, and that the Romans had fallen back from his camp. Suddenly he unleashed his cavalry against the enemy from right and left, and he himself counter-attacked from the center of the camp with the elite of his infantry. Seldom could one have found a battle more savage and more remarkable for losses on both sides, had daylight allowed it to go on. The onset of night, however, broke off an engagement that had started with enormous ferocity. As a result, the clash was marked more by its violence than loss of life, and the two sides left the field with equal losses, after a battle that was pretty much a draw. No more than 600 infantry fell on each side, and only half that number of cavalry, but the Romans suffered greater damage than the numbers would indicate, for the dead included some men of equestrian rank, 5 military tribunes, and 3 allied officers. After the battle, Hannibal withdrew into Liguria and Sempronius to Lucca. On his arrival, Hannibal was presented by the Ligurians with 2 Roman quaestors, Gaius Fulvius and Lucius Lucretius, who had been taken in an ambush, and with them 2 military tribunes and 5 men of equestrian rank, for the most part senators' sons. This gesture was intended to reassure Hannibal of the stability of his peace treaty and alliance with the Ligurians. 60. Meanwhile, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio had been sent to Spain with a fleet and an army, and while these events were taking place in Italy, he had left the mouth of the Rhone and skirted the Pyrenees, putting in at Emporiae. Disembarking his army there, he had, starting with operations against the Lusitani, brought under Roman control the entire coastline as far as the river Ebro. This he had done partly by renewing old alliances, and partly by forging new ones. The reputation he here established for clemency served him well, not only with the coastal peoples, but also with the more recalcitrant tribes of the interior and the mountains. With them he was able to conclude not just a non-aggression pact, but an offensive alliance as well, and some strong cohorts of auxiliary troops were raised from their number. Command of the area north of the Ebro lay with Hanno, whom Hannibal had left behind to safeguard the region. Believing he should face the Romans before everything fell into their hands, Hanno now encamped in sight of the enemy and led his men out for battle. The Roman commander also thought there should be a postponement of hostilities. He knew that he had to fight Hanno and Hasdrubal, and he preferred to take them on one at a time rather than together. The engagement proved to be no great struggle. 6,000 of the enemy were cut down and 2,000 captured, including the camp garrison, for the camp was stormed and the commander himself taken prisoner, along with several important people. The town of Cissus, close to the camp, was also taken by storm. But the booty from the town consisted of articles of little value, some primitive furniture and some worthless slaves. The camp, however, was a source of riches for the soldiers. It was the base not only of the army that had been defeated, but also of the army campaigning in Italy with Hannibal, and almost all valuables had been left south of the Pyrenees, so that the soldiers could not have heavy baggage to carry. 61. Hasdrubal had crossed the Ebro with 8,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry before he received reliable news of this defeat. His aim had been to meet the Romans as soon as they arrived, but after being told of the debacle at Cissus and the loss of the Carthaginian camp, he veered towards the coast. Not far from Turaco, he encountered the marines and crews from the Roman fleet, who were wandering aimlessly through the countryside, for success almost inevitably leads to carelessness. Hasdrubal sent out his cavalry in every direction against them, driving them back to their ships and producing great carnage and greater havoc. Not daring to linger in the area any longer for fear of being overtaken by Scipio, he then fell back across the Ebro. When Scipio received word of this new enemy, he did indeed lose no time in bringing up his column. Then, after punishing a few of the officers from the fleet, leaving a small garrison at Tarraco, he returned with the fleet to Emporia. Scipio had scarcely left when Hasdrubal reappeared on the scene. He pushed the Elargates, a tribe that had been given hostages to Scipio in insurrection and then accompanied by soldiers from that tribe. He laid waste the farmlands of allies who had remained loyal to Rome. Scipio was thus drawn from his winter quarters, but Hasdrubal once more retired from all the territory north of the Ebro. Scipio then launched a campaign against the Elargates, who were now abandoned by the man responsible for their uprising. He drove them all into their tribal capital at Antangoras, which he blockaded. In a matter of days, he took them back under his authority and control, exacting from them a greater number of hostages than he had on the earlier occasion, and imposing a fine on them as well. Scipio next advanced against the Occitani, close to the Ebro, who were also allies of the Carthaginians, and laid siege to their city. The Lusitani tried to bring them aid. They were their neighbors, but Scipio caught them in an ambush at night not far from the city which they were intending to enter. About 12,000 were killed, nearly all the others, their weapons thrown aside, dispersed far and wide throughout the countryside, and fled to their homes. As for the Occitani, now under siege, all that saved them was the winter weather that plagued their assailants. The blockade went on for 30 days, and during that time the depth of the snow was hardly ever less than 4 feet. Such was the snow cover on the Roman mantlets and siege sheds that it alone provided sufficient protection against the occasional firebrand hurled at them by the enemy. Eventually, their leader, Amusichus, sought refuge with Hasdrubal, and the Occitani surrendered after agreeing to a payment of 20 talents of silver. The Romans then returned to their winter quarters at Tarraco. 62. In Rome, its environs, there were many prodigies that winter, or rather many prodigies were reported, and too readily accepted, the usual experience when people's minds have turned to superstition. They included the following. A freeborn 6-month-old child had shouted, "Triumph in the vegetable market." In the Forum Boarium, an ox of its own accord climbed to the 3rd floor of a building and then thrown itself off when frightened by the alarmed reaction of the tenants. Glowing ship-like figures had appeared in the sky. The Temple of Hope in the vegetable market had been struck by lightning. At Lanuvium, a spear had moved on its own, and a crow had swooped down into the temple of Juno, actually settling on the goddess's couch. At several places in the countryside of Amiternum, figures of men had been seen in the distance dressed in white, but these had never come into contact with anyone. In Paestum, stones had fallen as a rain shower. At Caere, the oracular lots had shrunk. In Gaul, a wolf had unsheathed a centennial sword and made off with it. For all the other prodigies, the decemvirs were told to consult the scrolls, but for the shower of stones in Picenum, a 9-day sacrifice was officially prescribed. Then almost the entire citizenry promptly set about performing other ceremonies of expiation. First of all, the city was ritually purified, and full-grown sacrificial animals were killed for the gods specified by the decemvirs. A gold gift weighing 40 pounds was transported to Lanuvium for Juno, and the married women dedicated a bronze statue of Juno on the Aventine. A lectisternium was prescribed for Caere, where the oracular lots had shrunk, and public prayers were to be made to Fortune on Mount Algidus. At Rome, too, the lectisternarium At Rome, too, the lectisternium was prescribed here for Juventus. The public prayers were to be offered at the temple of Hercules, who was specifically named, but then the whole population was also directed to offer them at all the couches of the gods. 5 full-grown animals were sacrificed to the genius of Rome, and the praetor Gaius Atilius Serenus was ordered to make vows that would be discharged on condition that the republic were in the same position 10 years from then. These expiatory rites and vows that were performed in accordance with the Sibylline books did much to allay religious fears in people's minds. The legions wintering at Placentia had fallen by lot to Flaminius, one of the consuls designate, and he sent written instructions to the consul to have these troops quartered at Ariminum by 15th of March. It was Flaminius' intention to commence his consulship right there in the province, for he remembered his earlier disagreements with the Senate, when he was tribune of the plebs and later on consul. The disagreements first over his entry to the consulship with the senators tried to revoke, and then over his right to the triumph. But he was also unpopular with the senators because of a new bill, directed against the Senate, which Quintus Claudius had proposed, and which Gnaeus Flaminius was the only senator to support. The proposed law forbade anyone who was a senator, or whose father had been a senator, to own a sea-going vessel with a capacity of more than 300 amphorae, that being regarded as sufficiently large for transporting produce from a country estate for all commerce was considered unbecoming for senators. It was a contentious issue which had generated hostility amongst the nobility towards Flaminius, who had spoken for the bill, though it had also won him support amongst the people, and as a result gained him a second consulship. For these reasons, Flaminius felt the senators would keep him in the city by deliberately misinterpreting the auspices, or by using the delay imposed by the Latin festival, or anything else that could retard a consul. Accordingly, he pretended he had a journey to make, and slipped away furtively to his province as a private citizen. When this became public knowledge, it guaranteed fresh anger in the breast of the already hostile senators. Gaius Flaminius, they declared, was not at war not merely with the Senate, but with the immortal gods. When the auspices were unfavorable on the last occasion that he was made consul, gods and men tried to call him back from the actual battlefield, but he had not listened. Guiltily aware of the disrespect he had shown them, he had this time steered clear of the Capitol and the formal pronouncement of his vows. He did not want to come to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the day of his entry into the office. and did not want to see the deliberate with the Senate by which he was detested, and which he, and he alone, detested. He wished to avoid giving notice of the Latin festival, offering the customary sacrifice to Jupiter Laterius on the Alban Mount, proceeding to the capital to make his vows after taking the auspices, and then setting off for his province dressed in his military cloak and accompanied by his lictors. No, they said, he had gone secretly, furtively, without the decorations of office and without lictors, like a camp follower, and no differently than if he had left the country to become an exile, to enter office at Ariminum rather than Rome, they concluded, and to put on the praetexta in an inn rather than before his household gods. This, of course, better suited the majesty of his command. The vote for recalling Flaminius and making him return was unanimous. He was to be compelled to present himself for the performance of all his duties towards gods and men before leaving for his army and his province. It was decided that a delegation be sent to him, and Quintus Terentius and Marcus Antistius went as the delegates. However, they made no more impression on him than had the letter sent to him by the Senate during his previous consulship. A few days later, Flaminius entered his consulship. He was offering the sacrifice when the calf, which had already been dealt the blow, charged from the hands of the celebrants, spattering the bystanders with blood. A few days after Flaminius entered his consulship, he was offered the sacrifice, when the calf, which had already been dealt the blow, charged from the hands of the celebrants, spattering the bystanders with blood. The commotion and alarm was even greater amongst those further away, who had no idea of what was causing the excitement. This was interpreted by a number of people as a frightful omen. After that, Flaminius assumed command of the 2 legions from Sempronius and 2 from the praetor Gaius Atilius, and the army proceeded on its march into Etruria through the Apennine passes.